GB News, unlike other broadcasters, isn't obsessed with the London-Westminster bubble. We think there's a nation beyond the M25, and that's why we talk about the issues that matter across the land. Join me on State of the Nation, 8 to 9 o'clock, Monday to Thursday, on GB News. Daisy's listening, and you should too.
Now then, Lee Andersen here. Join me on GB News on my show, The Real World, every Friday at 7 p.m.
I'm not eating bloody cat. Are you
Delicious.
mental?
Open your mouth. OK, here comes a train.
Reminds me of the scene in Singing in the Rain.
Adam, is that a good one?
Whoa!
Join me at 7 on GB News, Britain's news channel.
Britain's Newsroom, weekday mornings from 9:30.
Are you across this microaggression story?
I'm across microaggressions. I'm also across XL bullies.
You would not last 5 minutes.
Oh, for God's
So
sake,
basic-
civil servants, give me strength.
So civil servants have been taught not to roll their eyes. Something you do very well. We both do it quite a lot, actually.
Because it's seen as an act of microaggression. This, by the way, this costs the taxpayer, this
Yes?
training, £160,000. What the hell is going on in our woke civil service? Who cares if someone rolls their eyes in exasperation?
What the hell is going on in our civil service, full stop, if the way that civil servants are communicating with each other is rolling their eyes and looking at their phones? I mean, is the government being run by people who are essentially acting to each other like stroppy teenagers?
Yeah.
But I'm all right with people, because, you see, I would be in defence of eye rolling.
So me too, I couldn't care less.
But do you know why? Because I want people to give me their genuine reaction, as long as it's not deeply offensive. But I want to know how people feel. And what they're being told here, civil servants are being taught, and of course this is an area of employment law, because people are taking cases against their bosses who roll their eyes at them. They're saying they're being encouraged to say nothing and nod their heads to promote transparency and inclusion. Don't show what you really think, just nod your head.
But I think that comes with then saying what you really think, and this is the key problem, and what these courses are trying to establish. And I looked into some of them when I was researching this, and it's not saying hide what you're feeling. It's saying, rather than huffing and puffing and rolling your eyes, if you've got a disagreement with someone, say I've got a disagreement with someone. Because otherwise, you can't have an effective workplace if people are sort of just passively, aggressively huffing at each other.
Why do these civil servants need to be taught this? Why do people need to be taught this? This is just normal discourse in a normal working day. You don't need a seminar on it.
Good afternoon, Britain.
Good afternoon, Britain. Join us, Tom and Emily,
To find out what's happening in the heart of Westminster.
and why it matters to you.
Weekdays from midday, we bring you the most compelling stories from across the United Kingdom.
And from your doorstep to our inbox,
That's right, we want to hear from you,
GB News.
Britain's news channel.
Hello and welcome to GB News Sunday, and thank you so much for joining us this lunchtime. Hope you're having a wonderful weekend. I'm Dawn Neeson. For the next 2 hours, we're keeping you company on TV, online and on digital radio. Cracking show coming up for you. In the first hour, former Conservative Deputy Chairman Lee Andersen has been suspended from the party after refusing to apologise for comments aimed at London Mayor Sadik Khan. But after Rishi Sunak warned of the dangers of polarisation and hatred in politics, was removing the whip from Andersen the best move for the party? Then, Just Stop Oil activists have circulated a manual to help protesters track down and occupy politicians' houses. I'm sorry, I can't believe this story. The document reportedly recommends studying photos of MPs clapping for carers, remember that, during COVID, for clues to their addresses. But given the discussions this week surrounding the safety of MPs, is this sort of intimidation tactic really appropriate? And this is a good one as well. Could Harry, yes, that Harry, be deported if Trump wins the presidential election? I'm not making this up. Donald Trump has said Prince Harry will be on his own if he wins a second term this year, after claiming the Duke of Sussex betrayed the Queen. In his memoir, Spare, the Prince admitted to formally taking drugs, which could be used as a ground to deny a US visa application, which could then threaten his immigration status. So will Trump kick Harry out? More importantly, do you want him back? But hey, this show is nothing without you and your views. It's not about me or any of my wonderful panel, it's your thoughts on all the stories we'll be discussing today. So get in touch. Email gbviews@gbnews.com or message me on our socials. Really simple, just @gbnews. But first, let's get those all-important news headlines with the very lovely Pip.
Thank you, Dawn. Good afternoon. It is 1:02. I'm Pip Thompson in the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister has been accused of harbouring extremists within his party, with the Labour leader saying it's time for him to get a grip. It's after Lee Andersen, the former deputy chair, was suspended from the party after he said the London mayor was controlled by Islamists. Sir Keir Starmer says Rishi Sunak's weakness allowed the MP to act with impunity. The Muslim Council of Britain is now demanding the Tories launch an investigation into alleged structural Islamophobia within its ranks. Deputy Prime Minister Oliver Dowden says it was right to remove the whip from Mr Andersen.
I don't believe that Lee Andersen is an Islamophobe, but words matter, and the choice of words that he used, the choice of words that he used was not appropriate. He was given the opportunity to apologise, didn't take that opportunity, and therefore the Chief Whip took the decision to remove the whip from him.
Another debate on Gaza will be held in the Commons after that chaotic vote last Wednesday. The SNP says it will take up the Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle's offer of a meaningful debate on a new ceasefire motion. There was uproar after he allowed MPs to vote on a Labour amendment, leading to calls for his resignation. SNP Westminster leader Stephen Flynn says his party will seek to move the debate forward that will push Parliament to support what he describes as concrete actions. The UK launched another round of airstrikes overnight against Houthi targets in Yemen. In a joint operation with the United States, 18 sites were hit across 8 locations. The Ministry of Defence says precision-guided bombs were used against drones and launchers. It follows a surge in attacks on commercial ships in the Red Sea. It's the 4th time the UK has been involved in strikes against the Iranian-backed group since mid-January. Donald Trump is another step closer to becoming the Republicans' presidential nominee. It's after he beat Nikki Haley in her home state of South Carolina, claiming 60% of the vote. It's his 4th straight primary win, despite being engulfed in legal problems.
An even bigger win than we anticipated, and I was just informed that we got double the number of votes that has ever been received in the great state of South Carolina. So that's pretty good. So it's a record ×2.
A local action group has won its fight over plans to house asylum seekers in Cumbria. Despite a severe housing shortage in the Milam area, 8 properties were earmarked for 40 migrants. It sparked backlash in the community, with police forced to increase patrols after one house was vandalised. In a letter seen by GB News, the Home Office has now ruled that the site is not fit for asylum seekers. Dean Myers from Milam Communication Action Group told us it's a huge relief.
The community's just been totally confused. We didn't know who was actually coming into the HMOs. No one consulted us, and it just sparked a bit of anger, I think.
Junior doctors in England have returned to the picket lines for a second day. They're striking for 5 days in a dispute over pay, this being the 10th time they've walked out since March last year. The Health Secretary is calling for more talks with the union, saying the British Medical Association refused to put the government's latest offer to its members. The BMA is asking for a 35% pay restoration as a starting position, but says it's open to negotiations. For the latest stories, sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now, it's back to Dawn.
Thank you very much, Pip. Right, OK, let's get straight into today's stories, shall we? Now, former Conservative Deputy Chairman Lee Andersen has been suspended from the party after refusing to apologise for comments aimed at London Mayor Sadik Khan. Andersen said the London Mayor had given the capital away and was controlled by Islamists. Sadik Khan had this to say yesterday.
Comments from a senior Conservative are Islamophobic. are anti-Muslim and are racist. I'm unclear why Rishi Sunak, why members of his cabinet aren't calling this out and aren't condemning this. It's like they're complicit in this sort of racism. And I think the message it sends is Muslims are fair game when it comes to racism and anti-Muslim hatred. It's not good enough in 2024 in the United Kingdom.
I must admit, I've never seen him as animated or as angry as he was when he made that statement yesterday morning. And very swiftly in the afternoon, Andersen was dropped, issuing this statement. Following a call with the Chief Whip, I understand the difficult position I have put both he and the Prime Minister in with regard to my comments. I fully accept that they had no option but to suspend the whip in these circumstances. However, I will continue to support the government's efforts to call out extremism in all its forms, be that anti-Semitism or Islamophobia. Its forms, be that anti-Semitism or Islamophobia, sorry there. Joining me now is political commentator Peter Spencer to bring us up to speed on what's happening with this story. Peter, thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. Peter, events moved incredibly quickly yesterday. What can you tell us about what happens now to Lee Andersen? He has been suspended, so what is the procedure from this point onwards?
Well, I mean, there can be no question that he's so fond of firing from the hip that he has now managed to shoot himself in both feet. Remember, it was so recently that he got overexcited about Rwanda and lost his job as the deputy chair of the party, which he subsequently very clearly regretted. And now he has been chucked out of the party for what is widely seen as Islamophobic commentary. Now, what happens next, frankly, is anyone's guess. I mean, it would not surprise me in the slightest bit if pretty soon he starts to wish he'd kept his gob shut a bit longer, or at least toned it down a little bit. Will they take it any further? Well, where else can they take it? And of course, then the question that there is this vague question, will he join another party like Reform? Well, I think that's very unlikely. My guess is that he will keep a little bit stum for the time being and say his prayers that at some point they will forgive him and let him back into the party.
Do you think if he apologised, he would be allowed back into the party? And would that indeed be the right thing for the Conservatives to do?
Well, it would certainly help, but I think that they couldn't do anything too hastily, because what Sadik Khan said, the London mayor, that the Conservative Party stands accused of harbouring Islamophobes, actually did resonate. And I do have to say that in one sense, Lee Andersen is a metaphor for something much broader. Remember that, which is the hatred and carnage of the Middle East is now spilling over into our streets in albeit a muted form. We have a serious spike in both anti-Semitic and anti-Islamic attacks. We have no fewer than 3 MPs of differing parties who now have special security protection because of presumably threats against their lives. And then, of course, that's one point. And then the second point is that we are expecting a general election at some point between the end of next month and the beginning of next year, God alone knows when, but there, give or take. And as a consequence, everybody is weaponizing everything. The debate, so-called, has become utterly toxic, and anything that looks like a potential target that's in range, they take a pop at it. In fact, they take a pop at it even if it isn't in range.
I mean, obviously, Lee isn't the only problem along these lines that the Conservative Party are facing at the moment. Suella Braverman and Liz Truss have both been very outspoken in some of the things they've said this week. Should the party take some sort of action against them?
Well, I don't actually quite see what they can do about it. I mean, what is manifestly happening is that the calculation has been taken in across a wide swathe of the Conservative Party, which that they are going to lose the next election. They're going to lose it very badly, in which case the immediate question is, right, who gets to replace Rishi Sunak? Oh, this is going to be lots of fun, isn't it? Let's have a jolly good old bun fight and bash one another up. And that, in short, is what's going on behind the scenes.
It is frightening because, you know, on the one hand, you've got accusations which seem to have been played out this week that the Conservative Party is riven with Islamophobia. But on the other hand, you've got the main opposition party, which, if we're all honest, look like they're going to win the next election, which still appears to have a huge problem with anti-Semitism.
Well, I think it's not fair to say huge. Keir Starmer is a funny old cove, but the fact is that he has been utterly ruthless in rooting out anti-Semites within his party. It would appear that his party's candidate, or earlier candidate for the forthcoming Rochdale by-election, managed to slip through the net, and he's been removed from the candidature, I think that's a word, because well, whatevs, yeah, because of what was perceived as his anti-Semitism, and of course that's left them in a complete frightful muddle. I mean, what the hell's going to happen in Rochdale? God alone knows.
And Peter, what do you make of the developments this week? On the front page, I think, of the Sunday Times today and the Sunday Telegraph, we have seen that MPs across the board need their security bolstered because of the threat they are all living under now. This mainly applies to 3 female MPs, I believe this story pertains to. What do you make of that situation?
Well, I think it's totally terrifying, to be honest. I mean, when I started in Parliament, people had not in Parliament, I should say, recovering Parliament. People actually had respect for MPs and a certain degree of reverence. Well, now it would appear that in this sort of crazy keyboard warrior age that we live in, they're fair game for actually being murdered. And there have been a few murders in recent years, remember. And of course, that was the Speaker of the House of Commons' defence during those chaotic scenes in Parliament last week when he bent the rules very severely and then got into frightful trouble for it because he said, look, what I have in mind here is the security of MPs. Upshot being, of course, that what was going on last week made Alice Land actually look really very sensible.
Peter, one final question. I mean, do you think now that most people will be put off about becoming MPs? At the time we really need good people to become MPs, this is not helping people go forward for that job, is that?
No, absolutely not. No, I mean, there's been numerous examples of people who've been offered the chance to stand for Parliament and said, look, thanks, but no thanks. Frankly, it's too dangerous, it's too beastly, and I simply don't want to go there. And so you have, in a sense, to that extent, to some degree, a body politic which is actually quite intimidated. And that is a very unwelcome, ugly development within our discourse.
Yeah, frightening stuff. Thank you very much. That's our Peter Spencer, former political correspondent for Sky. Thank you very much for joining us there, Peter. OK, huge debate to be had on this one, isn't there? So let's see I've got a great panel for you today. What my panel makes is I'm joined by former leader of UKIP, Henry Bolton, and co-founder of Novara Media, Aaron Bathani. Thank you very much for joining me this afternoon, gentlemen. Happy Sunday afternoon to you.
You too.
So glad to see you. Now, this is a huge debate to be had. A lot of things moved very fast yesterday. We had, I have to admit, the most animated I've seen Sadik Khan. Felt really passionately about what he was saying quite clearly. And then almost immediately after in the afternoon, we had Lee Andersen being suspended. Aaron, I'm going to come to you first on this one. What do you make of developments over the past few days?
Well, I generally don't like MPs losing the whip because I think ultimately they're representatives for 70,000 odd people, and I don't like centralised power with the party leaders. However, what he said was outrageous. And if there was a Labour politician who said that a Conservative mayor like Andy Street in the West Midlands was controlled by radical Jews, I think people would understand that as quite straightforwardly racist. With these kinds of topics, in particular, politicians need to be clear and thoughtful with their words. I would have a lower threshold for members of the public, but with politicians, we should have quite a high threshold. And I think he failed to meet that threshold. He could have apologised and said that. He's chosen not to. And I think, as well, one more variable is that he's going to lose his seat at the next election, in all likelihood. So I was surprised to hear from that gentleman just then that actually, in all likelihood, he will return to the fold. I think there are high incentives for him to join Reform or stand as an independent. Not that he will, but I don't think it's as implausible as was being made out there.
OK, that was Peter Spencer, former Sky political correspondent. Coming to you on this one, Henry. I mean, do you think Lee Andersen it was right that he was suspended for what he said?
That's a matter for the Conservative Party, and I actually tried to join the Conservative Party, and they said that I'd be a troublemaker because I've got a high profile. What they don't
There's
want...
quite a lot of them already there, though, isn't there?
Yeah, there are. But there is a fear in the Conservative Party that seems to be increasing of people speaking out, and what I would echo the words just said, that actually politicians need to be thoughtful about the language that they use. Of course they do. However, we should not just leave it at that, because Lee Andersen is reflecting an increasing sense of concern across society. And I'm not talking about extremists, I'm not talking about people on the far right, I'm talking about sort of generally small c conservative people who are quiet, fairly humble in their life, they just get on with it, but they are massively concerned at what they see. And, you know, the comments about Sadiq Khan has embarked upon a series of policies and decisions that actually appear... He needs to be careful if this is wrong, because it is the perception that he is creating, and anybody who says then it's not is in denial or has got their own agenda. But he's seemingly pursuing a series of decisions and policies that are removing or overwhelming the traditional character and customs and history of the City of London. And he's got to remember, the City of London is the capital city of the United Kingdom, not just his town. And, you know, the renaming of railway lines and so on, the issue over the statue on the fourth plinth in Trafalgar Square. These sort of things send the message to, if you like, the more traditional English white community that he wants to suppress their culture.
Henry, I think that's a really interesting point you've just made there. I mean, viewers are getting in touch. GBviews at GBnews, please do get in touch. You already are. This is a subject that's very close to all your hearts. Robert has said, yet another MP removed from the Tory party for telling the truth. Echoing what you're saying, there does appear to be, Aaron, out there, a silent majority who, as Henry said, they're not racist, but they are concerned about how they perceive things to be going. One example being the beaming of the From the River to the Sea on Big Ben, and nothing. I know the tower isn't called Big Ben, that's the bell, but on the tower. And nothing was done about that. So there is that perception that people are frightened to speak out. And a lot of people already getting in touch saying, Lee Andersen was echoing what I think. What do you make of that?
Elizabeth Tower.
It's Elizabeth Tower. Yeah, a shorthand. OK, whatever.
What I would say is, look...
Although if Sadik has his hands, it'll probably be changed.
There you go. Maybe Martin Luther King Tower. What I would say is, if you want to criticise Sadiq Khan for being a liberal, by all means do that. I think he's a vanilla, identikit liberal. Yeah,
or knife crime, or ruining TfL, etc.
Well, you can have that point of view.
There's lots of criticism.
That's fine. You can have that on ULEZ or whatever. Yeah. For instance, his position on LGBT rights, he's clearly not an Islamist. He's very much, to me, an identikit, vanilla, liberal, centre-left politician who happens to be a Muslim. And I think, actually, if Lee Andersen thinks about it, if Henry thinks about it, they probably agree with that. So if you want to criticise him for that, by all means do, or the renaming of the various train lines, etc., please, go ahead. But he's not an Islamist.
You said...
It's inaccurate. It's just simply inaccurate.
I think about it a great deal. I spend most of my time thinking about these sort of things, as you probably do. We come to different conclusions. But the thing is that when you combine his policies with the behaviour of the Metropolitan Police with regards to the Palestinian protests, with the threats and the intimidation of members of Parliament, direct or indirect, he is in a position as the Mayor of London to speak out against these things. And when he says London was built by immigrants, well, I mean, if he goes back about 2,000 years, yes, I'll give him that. But actually, that's not the case. You know, if you look at the profile, the demographic profile of London as it was 30 years ago, 40 years ago, it was very different. And London became the world's capital built by British people, not the immigrant community.
And unfortunately, Henry, we're running out of time, so we have to move on at the moment. But because we've mentioned the election, here are the candidates standing in the Rochdale by-election. Azir Ali, Labour; Mark Coleman, Independent; Simon Danczak, Reform UK; Ian Donaldson, Liberal Democrat; Paul Ellison, Conservative; George Galloway, Workers' Party of Britain; Michael Howarth, Independent; William Howarth, Independent; Guy Otten, Green Party; Ravin Rodent Subordinate, Official Monster Raving, Looney Party; and David Tully, Independent. Right, you are watching and listening GB News Sunday with me, Dawn Neeson. A lot more coming up on today's show. Now, this is another good story. Just Stop Oil activists have circulated a manual to help protesters track down and occupy politicians' homes. The document reportedly recommends studying photos of MPs clapping for carers during COVID for clues to their addresses. But given the discussions this week, what we've just been talking about, the safety of MPs are paramount, surely, and these sorts of imitation, really, is that appropriate? What do you think? Now, all of that and much more to come. You're watching and listening to GB News, Britain's news channel. Don't go too far.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
The Camilla Tominey Show, Sunday mornings from 9:30.
I appreciate the story isn't in today's papers, but it has been running all week, and it's this row over the use of nitrogen hypoxia to kill this man who was on death row in Alabama. And it's been linked back to you, and I wanted to ask you about it because this is intriguing, because you did a television show back in 2015 where you, I believe, tested this method of execution. Just tell me briefly about it, Michael. What happened?
I didn't test this method of execution, and it was a bit longer ago than that. But what I did do was test hypoxia. So I tested various ways in which people are killed in the United States, and asked the question as to whether there was a more humane way of doing it. So I was put into hypoxic situations, for example, into a chamber run by the Netherlands Air Force, which simulated what happens if you're in an aircraft at 30,000 feet and suddenly the windows blow out. And what happened to me was that I was almost instantly rendered incapable. As an experiment, I was trying to play with children's toys, putting triangle shapes into triangle spaces, and I was quickly unable to do that. I was asked, what is 9 minus 5? And I said 5. And then the officer who was with me, the Air Force officer who was wearing an oxygen mask, said to me, Michael, put your mask on or you will die. And I was incapable of putting my own mask on. Now, this suggested that hypoxia was very fast acting, and that you had... Obviously, I was in no pain or anything like that. I was just completely unaware. By the way, this is why, if you're on an aircraft and it depressurizes, you must put your own mask on first. But of course, I can't go on and draw conclusions.
No.
We did not experiment with nitrogen. But what I can say is it was evident to me that hypoxia renders you incapable almost instantaneously.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to GB News Sunday. Happy Sunday. Hope you're having a marvellous weekend. I'm Dawn Neeson. I'm your TV, online and digital radio on GB News. Now, Just Stop Oil activists have circulated a manual to help protesters track down and occupy politicians' homes. You heard that right. occupy politicians' homes. The document reportedly recommends studying photos of MPs clapping for carers during COVID, remember that, for clues to their addresses. Ministers urged police to take robust action against protesters after it was revealed that they are plotting to target politicians' offices and homes ahead of the general election. In the week we've just had, where we've had mobs, and they were a mob outside Parliament. We've had security being increased. If you've seen your Sunday papers, front page of the Times and Telegraph, security increased, in particular for female MPs. We have a story about eco-warriors saying they are going to occupy not MPs' offices, not the House of Parliament, but MPs' homes. I'm sorry. What is happening to this world? Let's see what my marvellous panel make of this one. Aaron and Henry are still with me. Henry, coming to you first on this one. I find this story particularly shocking, I must admit, in this week of all weeks.
Well, it's certainly worrying. We must recognise, I think, that this sort of protest has always been in existence. The Duke of Wellington, at the beginning of the 1800s... Well, the
I'm not quite that old, Henry. No, come on, give me a break.
His nickname was the Iron Duke, and the reason he was called the Iron Duke was because he had to fit iron shutters to the windows of his house because the mob kept
I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So people think it's because of his military background. It's not. No, so it's always been there. The thing is that in that time, you know, you had the militia deployed and you had the peelers, and then you had the policing of protests was far more effective, maybe sometimes quite brutal, and I'm glad we've moved on from that. But the point is that these protests have effectively been allowed to happen, have been allowed to up the ante in terms of criminal damage, intimidation, harassment from the eco side, and then we've obviously had the Palestinian Gaza things, which have had the same sort of effect. There's not been effective policing of it. They've been allowed to get away with it, and that is why I think we're seeing the eco lot ramp up their threats, their rhetoric, and their implied intimidation of MPs. And I say implied because they haven't actually invaded a home yet. And
well,
I hope they don't.
It was only...
But we need effective policing. The whole policing sort of ethos, again, it goes back to the City of London, or to London again, not the City of London, London as a whole. And the policing has broken down. I'm a former police officer.
Yes.
And I was speaking to somebody who's recently left the police, and he's saying people are leaving, the good people are leaving the police hand over fist because the leadership is politicised and they're now recruiting the wrong people. You recruit the wrong people, you'll lose the best people. And that's what's happening.
And we have actually seen this. We had an example, didn't we, Aaron, in the summer where, I mean, it wasn't our Just Stop Oil, it was Greenpeace, but they were actually climbing on Rishi Sunak's roof. I mean, so they do this sort of thing. This isn't an idle threat.
So I haven't seen the contents of this report. You never know with these kinds of things. So that's the first point. Secondly, I don't think it's appropriate to
occupy
somebody's personal home. I think an office is different. I think there is the right to protest. We're allowed to have, quote-unquote, Aggie protests. You know, it was the same with the Countryside Alliance in the early 2000s. They had that right. But I think with homes, I disagree with that. I think it's probably unwise, and I don't think it looks good. But isn't it funny? Jeremy Corbyn, for years, was beamed onto our TV screens with the media camped outside, squatting outside, showing the world where he lived and what his house looked like. And the second it's actually politicians in the centre, oh, my God, don't do this, please, we'll freak out. So I am sort of feeling a bit of bit of hypocrisy, not from you, but in terms of how this story is going... No, not from me in the slightest, Dawn. In how this story is playing out, because I agree that actually these are homes. Therefore, I don't understand why dozens of journalists were camped outside that poor man's home for years.
But to be fair,
accosting even his mother-in-law.
It wasn't just him. We have seen shots of Boris Johnson going jogging from his home. We had our... we've had various...
I've been subjected to it. For months, my mother, elderly mother, bless her, she's passed on now, had people, media... no, not mainstream media, they were all the hacks, all the freelancers, camped outside her house Okay, she was an elderly, quite infirm lady. She had to have police parked out there 24/7. And my then partner had exactly the same. Her mother was harassed. Crowds of people following her dog walking in the woods, for God's sake. Yeah, all photographed.
That is ridiculous.
And so we have a problem, and that's the media. The problem. Nobody, I think, expects the media to actually. To go into your home, actually invade your space in that way, threaten your family with threats and intimidation in that way. It's intimidating having crowds of media around you sometimes, perhaps, but this is a different thing. And there is an implied risk or potential of violence there, even if it's confrontation, which takes this to another level. And I really think it is because we have utterly failed to effectively police these protests up till now. Criminal damage is a crime. It's arrestable. People should be arrested and charged. No if, no but. And the same with causing harassment, alarm and distress. It's against the public order. I've arrested people for that, and it needs to be dealt with firmly.
It used to are just so good. We're running out of time all the time, honestly.
Sorry,
I'm going to have to move on. Yeah, you're going to shut up next time.
Yeah.
Right.
Give somebody else
I mean that in a nice way,
yeah.
obviously. Right, OK, now we have reached out to Just Stop Oil for a comment, and they have sent this statement, which I'm just going to read in full for you. Just Stop Oil supporters are trained in non-violence, and we choose our actions very carefully, depending on the context. Where we have visited MPs' homes in the past, it has looked very different to what the Mail on Sunday, that's where the story comes from, describes. For example, last year we sang Christmas carols outside Keir Starmer's house and sat peacefully outside one of Rishi Sunak's many houses. It is important to acknowledge that we all deserve safety in our homes, however. These people who are making decisions that affect us all and in enabling the continued drilling of new oil and gas, both major parties are endangering all of our homes and families. Doesn't sound quite like we're not going to do this, does it? Any case, you're watching and listening to GB News Sunday with me, Dawn Neeson, and there's loads more coming up on today's show. But first, let's get the news headlines with Pip Thompson.
Thanks, Dawn. It is 1:33. Good afternoon. I'm Pip Thompson in the GB newsroom. The Prime Minister has been accused of harbouring extremists within his party, with the Labour leaders saying it's time for him to get a grip. Today, the former Deputy Chair, Lee Andersen, who was suspended by the Tories, still refused to apologise for saying the London Mayor was controlled by Islamists. The Muslim Council of Britain is now demanding that the party launch an investigation into alleged structural Islamophobia within its ranks. Deputy Prime Minister Oliver Dowden says it was right to remove the whip from Mr Andersen.
I don't believe that Lee Andersen is an Islamophobe, but words matter, and the choice of words that he used, the choice of words that he used was not appropriate. He was given the opportunity to apologise, didn't take that opportunity, and therefore the Chief Whip took the decision to remove the whip from him.
The SNP says it will take up the Speaker Sir Lindsay Hoyle's offer of a meaningful debate on a new Gaza ceasefire motion. There was uproar after he allowed MPs to vote on a Labour amendment last Wednesday, leading to calls for his resignation. SNP Westminster leader Stephen Flynn says his party will now push Parliament to support what he describes as concrete actions. The UK launched another round of airstrikes overnight against Houthi targets in Yemen, following a surge in attacks on commercial shipping in the Red Sea. In a joint operation with the United States, 18 sites were hit across 8 locations. It's the 4th time the UK's been involved in strikes against the Iranian-backed group since mid-January. Donald Trump is another step closer to becoming the Republicans' presidential nominee. It's after he beat Nikki Haley in her home state of South Carolina, claiming 60% of the vote. It's his 4th straight primary win, despite being engulfed in legal problems. You're up to date, but for the latest stories, do sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Thank you so much, Pip. Now, remember, you can get in touch about all the topics we're talking about today by emailing me on gbviews@gbnews.com or messaging on our socials at gbnews. Really simple. But there's loads more coming up on today's show for you. A police force has come under fire after scrapping compulsory fitness tests on the grounds they are unfair on women. Hello, I am one. It's not unfair. But surely you want your officers to be fit to look after you? I know I do. All of that and much more to come. I'm Dawn Neeson, a woman, fairly fit, and you're watching and listening to GB News on your radios. Dawn Neeson, Britain's news channel. Don't go too far. Make a cuppa.
Wake up to the headlines with Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. We treat you to the day's biggest stories before anyone else, 7 days a week. You can catch up on everything you need to know before you've even had your kippers. Headliners every morning at 5 a.m. only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Good afternoon, Britain. Weekdays from midday.
Chris, what is the preferred way in which the police go about their business at the moment? There's these two strands of thinking: evidence-based policing versus bobbies on the beat.
It's very, very difficult. The problem that police have got, basically, is that they're too thinly spread, and it's too much is expected of them. There's a long list, isn't it? Every month we hear police need to do more about this, police need to do more about that, and police do their best. They're overwhelmed with bureaucracy. I mean, when I was a young PC, if I took a shoplifter in, then I'd be in and out within an hour. You take a shoplifter in now, and you're doomed for the rest of your shift for 6 or 7 hours dealing with the bureaucracy. Police want to get back in those communities because community policing is really the core of policing. But such are the demands on their time at the moment, and the bureaucracy, and the fact that they are struggling now to retain experienced officers. People are hemorrhaging out of the police, and new recruits coming in haven't got that experience, and there's a good chance they may not stay anyway. So there's all sorts of problems. And for the Home Secretary to glibly say he wants more done, frankly, clearly shows he's got no understanding of the pressure police are under, and of course the constant criticism that they face across the board. Very rarely do you actually hear of police officers getting praised for acts of bravery or acts of compassion. So there's a problem with morale in the police force, and clearly a problem with the Home Secretary, who needs to get out there and talk to officers on the front line who frankly are struggling. And last night, of course, was a graphic example.
Every Sunday from 11, join Michael Portillo.
There will be topical discussion, looking at the week before and the week to come. So kick back and relax at 11 a.m. on Sundays on GB News with me, Michael Portillo. GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
When the news happens, it happens here.
And really important breaking news.
Breaking news this morning.
On TV, radio and online, the news starts here on Britain's Newsroom.
All the biggest stories and the answers that you need from across the UK and beyond.
Join Britain's Newsroom from 9:30 on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall?
Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Welcome back to GB News Sunday with me, Dawn Neeson, on your TV, online and on digital radio. Now, I love this story, being a woman of a certain age. A police force has come under fire after scrapping compulsory fitness tests on the grounds they are unfair on... Checking my notes. Oh, yeah, women. British Transport Police have said that female officers were suffering indirect discrimination from doing a so-called bleep test, in which they have to run up and down and do a 15-metre track for 3 minutes, 35 seconds. It's easy. It's not complicated. Because they were far more likely to foul than the men. I.e., I have no words, which is really not a good look in this job, to be honest with you. Aaron, I'm going to come to you first on this one. Obviously, you can identify as a woman if you'd like to talk about this subject, but basically, they're saying that we're being discriminated against because we're not as fit as we should be to do the job. And it's not just women. This applies to older men in British Transport Force. You're looking at me in that way. Only you can look at me.
Yeah, no, look, I'm here to be the lefty. Right, but let me say...
Lefty in the corner!
Hey, I'm here to be the lefty. But this is a really silly story. So only 8% of women fail this test anyway. It's not like the majority of women are failing this test. Obviously, I think the bleep test to get into the British Transport Police is around 4.5. So anybody that did a PE at school knows it's not particularly onerous. It's not easy, but anybody could do it, basically, with a little bit of...
We are going to have a trial run in the studio later, so be careful what you say, boys.
I didn't bring my running shoes. So 8% of women fail it. I mean, it's not fair, but then these are genuine differences between men and women, and the vast majority of women can do it. 4.5 is very low. In the infantry, I think it's just below 9. 9 is quite strenuous, so that gives you a taste of actually how comparatively low it is. So I find this a silly story. Most women aren't affected by it. If you want to be a member of the police, you probably should be quite fit. You don't need to be a triathlete, but quite fit will do.
Quite fit will do. Henry, I mean, I do find, like Aaron, I do find this a silly story, but on the other hand, the serious side is I do want a police force that can physically protect me when I need it, like
Indeed.
run after a crook example.
Indeed. And, I mean, there are all sorts of things about this. I was in the infantry and I was in the police, and I can tell you there's a big difference in the fitness level test-wise. And, if we do this, are we then going to start applying the same thing to the Army, Navy and Air Force and say, well, actually, it's a bit unfair on whoever, so we need to... in the Navy, it's a bit unfair on people who are colourblind, isn't it? They can't join the Navy. What a shame. We're going to have to change the standards and the rules. No. There are certain agencies, certain organisations that are there to protect us, and they are protecting us against... forces, entities, individuals, circumstances that are incredibly challenging, not just physically but mentally. And if you are fit in body, you are often going to be more fit in mind as well, and therefore more able to deal with the trauma and the emotional difficulties of dealing with the things that you'll come across in the police. I personally don't care whether somebody, is big, large, small, tiny, whatever colour they are, whatever religion they are. I expect the British police force to recruit and train the best possible people, because if I need to call on them, I need to know that they are producing the best possible quality response, the same with the fire service and so on in the armed forces, to protect me, my family, my community, my society. And anything that compromises on that is a failure. It's a failure of leadership, it's a failure of policy, and it's a failure of operational understanding of what you're there to do. And so, sorry, I get a little bit upset about this.
But no, you have, I mean, to be fair, Henry, you have both served in the military and you've served in the police force.
But it's also, just very briefly, without hogging the floor again, but I cringe when I go around London. I don't live in London, and I see, it's particularly something in London, I see police officers with their hats on the back of their heads, their hands in their pockets, they haven't shaved, they're a mess. And that might sound ridiculous, but actually it's about the discipline, it's about the ethos, and the British public need to be able to trust, rely upon and turn to these people with confidence, and the guilty should fear them.
Aaron, I'm just going to bring you quickly in this bit. I'm running out of time, but people think it's just the British Transport Police. They just hang around stations making sure that people are getting through the station. But if we think back to the London Bridge terror attacks, the British Transport plays a large part in helping that situation there. So it is an important role.
Totally. I mean, if you've got antisocial behaviour, and that is a very broad term, it can be somebody who's a bit mouthy to somebody who's literally starting a fight on a train. You're going to need people who can deal with that situation. And look, just to be clear, this isn't asking for elite fitness. This is really saying, can you carry a light jog for 10 minutes? That's what it's not even 10 minutes. So I worry. And it's one of those stories, we can talk about left, right, polarisation. I think the overwhelming majority of the British public would say, this is silly.
It's silly.
It doesn't break down by voter preference or age. They probably say, if you want to join the police, you probably should be able to jog for 5 minutes.
Yeah, exactly.
It's beyond silly, it's dangerous because it creates an impression that the police actually aren't up to doing this job.
Wow.
Which I think, you know, in the way that it's publicised. Anyway.
We have to move on. Not for the first time. I'm saying, Henry, be quiet. Right, but there's a lot. I won't tell him anymore, I promise. OK, lots more coming up on today's show. Another great story, this one. Could Harry be deported, Prince Harry, if Trump wins a presidential election? Donald Trump has said that Prince Harry will be on his own if he wins a second term this year after claiming the Duke of Sussex betrayed the Queen. Now, in his memoir, Spare, the Prince admitted to formally taking drugs, which could be used as grounds to deny a US visa application, and that could threaten Harry's immigration status. So, will Trump kick Harry out? And more importantly, do you want him back? All of that and much more to come. I'm Dawn Neeson, and you're watching and listening to GB News, Britain's news channel.
In the GB Newsroom, we bring you the news as it happens. With our team of dedicated journalists across the UK, we're ready to give you accurate reporting every day. When the news breaks, we'll be there with bulletins on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Lee Andersen's Real World. Fridays from 7 p.m.
Dr. Jane Jones, who's the clinical lead for Care After Combat.
Yeah.
Jane, thanks for coming. And just tell me a little bit about your organisation. What do you do?
OK, well, thank you for having me here so we can talk about Care After Combat. So we are an organisation, a charity, who work into the prison system, working with military veterans who've somehow got involved with the justice system and...
So there's quite a high population of ex-servicemen and women in our prisons. Why is that, do you think?
So 2014, the government did a review of who was resident in UK prisons, and what they found were that military veterans are the highest occupational group, and this obviously raises some concerns. Yeah. So the government wanted to do something about that, and so they supported Care After Combat initially, just as a scoping exercise, really, to see if there was any way we could help these men and women actually, you know, understand the problems that led to offending behaviour and go on to lead successful lives.
So what sort of offending behaviour are we talking typically for people that's in prison that's actually served in our armed forces?
Primarily, it's violence.
Yeah.
So that is the highest offence that we work with.
Okay.
But of course, the military, as with everybody else, it's the full range of offending behaviour.
OK, so we're in a pub, Jane, Dr. Jane, and I guess for some people, you know, the odd tip of alcohol is good, a bit of fun of a weekend, relax, let your hair down. But for some people, alcohol is not always their best friend, and I guess that plays a part in some of your veterans that end up inside.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, speaking from my own experience, a good 2/3 of the people I work with have some kind of mental health problem or mental health difficulty, struggling to either adapt into civilian life or with some of the traumas they've experienced during service. People might self-medicate with alcohol to manage some of those thoughts and feelings.
Yeah. Your weekend starts here with Friday Night Live with me, Mark Dolan, 8 till 9 on GB News. Big stories, big guests and big laughs as we get you ready for a cracking weekend. That's Friday Night Live with Mark Dolan. Fridays 8 till 9 on GB News. Bring your own drinks. The admission's free.
Have a great Saturday night with me, Leo Curse, on the Saturday Night Showdown. It's a crazy world out there, so come and make fun of it with me, my panel of comedians, and a couple of people who actually know what they're talking about. This Saturday Night Showdown is your front row ticket to the clown show every Saturday, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to GB News Sunday with me, Dawn Neeson, on your TV, online and on radio. Now, Donald Trump has said Prince Harry will be on his own if the former president wins a second term this year, after claiming the Duke betrayed the Queen. In his memoir, Spare, the Prince admitted to formally taking marijuana, cocaine and psychedelic mushrooms, all of which could be used as grounds to deny a US visa application, which could threaten Harry's US immigration status. And now, if Trump wins a second term, and anything's possible. This is America. He said, I wouldn't protect him. He betrayed the Queen. That's unforgivable. He would be on his own if it was down to me. Meanwhile, Biden has said it's not really an issue. I have no idea what to make of this one, so I'm going to ask my learned gentleman. Aaron, coming to you first on this one.
Well, fortunately for Harry, it's not down to him, is it? It's down to the immigration agency. I do find it funny that if you have any use of drugs in your past, you won't be able to get a visa application to the US, because pretty much ask every British rock band since the 1960s and they'd be in the same boat. So,
well, Nigella Lawson, wasn't she, in 2014?
Yeah.
I mean, she was turned away.
I mean, Mick Jagger's there every 10 minutes, so I don't know. I mean, so it's an interesting one. And obviously it generates headlines, which is what Trump is so expert at. But I have a proposal. Let's do a swap.
Go on, go for it, Aaron.
We send back Boris. After all, he was born in New York, and we get Harry.
I don't think we want Harry.
It's like a hostage exchange.
GB News, if you agree with that one. What's in that mug there? Henry, what do you make of this one?
Well, what the Americans do with Harry is up to them. All I can say is that I think that Harry should stay over there. He should stay quiet. He should make a life for himself. Get on. You know, he's a wealthy man. He's got lots of sort of potential. He can do things over there. Please do it. Leave us alone. Don't interfere with the royal family. And I wish you a happy life. But please, Donald, you know, don't send him back, because it's just going to be a headache.
What do we make of the whole Donald Trump thing? I mean, he won last night, beating, Nikki Haley in her home state. He does seem unstoppable.
He does, although you do have these incredible fines. Like, again, I'm on the left. I'm not a fan of Donald Trump, but the fines are extraordinary. You know, $300 million fines.
Yeah.
And I wonder what that does to him and his bottom line. But in terms of winning the Republican candidacy, that's a dead cert. I saw polling yesterday in a battleground state, I think it was Michigan. You know, amongst African-American men, he's up at 25%. Now, bear in mind, I think last time he was below 10%. In 2016, he was below 10%. So that gives you a flavour, actually, in the states where it matters. Don't look at the national polls. Look at places like Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Michigan. He could very well. I actually would have him down as the favourite. Then again, November's a long way away. In politics, a week is a long time, let alone, 8 months?
Yeah, well, yes, he said, I wish I could do it quicker, talking to the actual... Henry?
Well, Nikki Haley, who's the sort of only person who's standing against him at the moment for the Republican nomination, I think she's only in it because something unforeseen might happen. He might trip down and break his neck. He might I don't wish it on him, but or anybody. But the thing is, anything can happen, as Aaron says. You know, it's November that we're talking about, and so you know, if you've got to be in the game to win the game. But I think it is a strange phenomenon that on the surface, that that somebody who's being hauled through the courts, who has done things that he should not have done. I mean, the thing with the classified documents, he's banged to rights. You know, way back about 30 years ago, I was custodian for very high classified documents in a British military headquarters, and it's the same management as the political sphere. Just because you're president or prime minister doesn't make it any different. Those documents are managed in the same way. And so he's banged to rights on that. But the more, as you say, the more he gets into trouble, the more popular he becomes. And that is because, in a way, what we were talking about earlier in the programme, the public are of a view that it's the deep state acting against him.
It's the deep state. We keep coming back to the deep state. Right, OK, you're watching and listening to GB News Sunday with me, Dawn Neeson. Lots more coming up on today's show, but let's just find out what the weather's doing from Deep State Jonathan. Here you go.
A brighter outlook with Box Solar, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Jonathan Vautry here with your GB News weather forecast provided by the Met Office. Southern districts are bearing the brunt of the rainfall today. We've seen it sweeping its way in, some heavy pauses at times, and it will stay very persistent, particularly in the southeast right throughout tonight. With this additional rainfall adding on top of what we've already had this winter, we could see some disruption in places. Elsewhere, some clearer spells for the night. Some showers pushing in across Scotland, falling as snow over the higher ground areas might bring some icy stretches, as well as temperatures begin to tumble off. Patchy frost across areas of Scotland and the far north of England as well. Temperatures just holding up a touch more underneath the cloud in the southeast, but it is going to be a very dreary, wet start here, and it will take some time for that rain to eventually clear its way off. Quite a brisk northeasterly wind pushing its way in will make it feel quite cold. That wind will also bring in some showers for northeast England and northeast Scotland, but there will be some sunny spells in between all of that, and into the afternoon many of us will have a fairly fine end to the day. Temperatures around where we'd expect them to be for the time of year. These fine conditions are being brought by a ridge of high pressure that is extending itself across the UK. But into Tuesday, that is slowly going to sink its way southwards and allow this cold front to start moving its way in from the northwest. So starting to see wetter, windier conditions for Northern Ireland and Scotland. That will eventually spread its way into England and Wales later on in the day. But for much of central, southeastern areas of England, it will be a fine, dry start to the morning with some sunshine in there. But it remains fairly unsettled and changeable right throughout the rest of this week. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Thank you very much, Jonathan. I would just like to make clear that Jonathan isn't actually from the Deep State, he's from the Met Office. And they're not the same thing. Probably. In any case, thank you very much, Jonathan. And now there's lots more coming up on today's show. Private security is being deployed to protect MPs amid warnings the Israel-Hamas conflict is a generalising, radicalising moment. All of that and much more to come. I'm Dawn Neeson and you're watching a GB News, Britain's news channel. Now don't go too far.
I'm Christopher Hope.
And I'm Gloria Di Piero, bringing you
PMQ's live here on GB News. Every Wednesday, we'll bring you live coverage of Prime Minister's questions when Rishi Sunak and Sir Keir Starmer go head-to-head in the House of Commons.
We'll be asking our viewers and listeners to submit the questions that they would like to put to the Prime Minister, and we'll put that to our panel of top politicians in our Westminster studio.
That's PMQ's live here on GB News, Britain's election channel.
GB News Breakfast. Every day from 6 a.m.
Look, you're a respected royal biographer, and there are so many people who are on the sort of royal gravy train, if you will, people who are making a career out of gossip and speculation. But yours very much built on confidence and sources and facts. And you don't offer an opinion that often inside your book. But when you do, I suppose, therefore, it carries a bit more weight. So when you say that the Sussexes are easily offended and, you know, effectively pretty prickly, what do you mean and what have you based that on?
Well, on numerous their riposte to any given situation in their books, in their TV interviews. And let's not forget, there have been a lot of TV interviews, 6-part Netflix drama, Spare. You see time and again that they feel that they feel resentful. They feel that, you know, something hasn't gone their way and that this is part of some sort of calculated campaign against them. And actually, I mean, when you've got a fast-moving story, I mean, for example, in my book, I go into those frantic hours after the death of the Queen, and everybody's trying to sort themselves out. And Harry writes in his book Spare how you know, no one will return his calls and he can't get through to anyone, and it's sort of it's just all a bit me. And actually, the whole kind of royal machine, if you like, is a team effort. And I just think it's very sad because, you know, Harry and Meghan, they had such potential. And now when we do tend to hear from them, on a royal matter, it's just to say how miserable they were being royal. And that was, you know, they were royal for whatever it was, 600-700 days. They're post-royal now for over twice that time. Can you envisage a scenario where they're back in England and they're back in royal life? I can't envisage a situation where they're back, as it were, as part of the sort of royal working unit, but I could certainly see it becoming a kind of normal thing for them to keep.
Big news, big debates, big opinion. Patrick Christie's Tonight is the week's biggest show. Every weekday, 9 to 11 p.m, we've got the inside track on the day's top stories. There'll be sharp takes you won't get anywhere else. We will set the news agenda, not just follow it, and I want to bring you along for the ride. Whatever it is, we'll have our finger on the pulse. It's news, but it's this close to entertainment. Patrick Christie's Tonight, 9 till 11 p.m, only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello and welcome to GB News Sunday. Happy Sunday afternoon. I hope you're having a wonderful weekend. Thank you so much for joining us this lunchtime. I'm Dawn Neeson, and for the next hour, I'm going to be keeping you company on TV, online and on digital radio. Now, coming up, cracking show for you. 3 female MPs have been given bodyguards and chauffeur-driven cars after concerns about their safety. Representatives of the Conservative and Labour parties had their security upgraded after a risk assessment. But should it have ever come to this? It's scary, isn't it? Then the SNP says it will push for another Commons debate on Gaza following the chaotic, I think is putting it mildly, vote on the conflict this week. There was uproar in the Commons when Speaker Sir Lindsay Hoyle allowed MPs to vote on a Labour amendment to the SNP's ceasefire motion. But this is just gesture politics and a huge waste of time. Or is it important that we do it all again? And then the youngsters have it all too easy. A mind-blowing 93% of 18 to 24-year-olds can't even be bothered to go to an in-person interview. So, asking as an older person, are Generation Lazy taking the mick? But this show is nothing without you and your views. It's not about me, not about my brilliant panel, it's all about you. So let us know your thoughts on all the stories we're discussing today. Email me at gbviews@gbnews.com or message on our socials at gbnews. But first, let's get the news headlines with Pip Thompson.
Dawn, thank you. Good afternoon. I'm Pip Thompson in the GB newsroom. Labour is demanding assurances that suspended MP Lee Andersen won't have the whip returned. Today, the former deputy chair still refused to apologise for saying that the London mayor was controlled by Islamists. Shadow Cabinet Office Minister Jonathan Ashworth has written to the Prime Minister to confirm he won't be allowed back in the party. Speaking to Camilla Tominey earlier, Deputy Prime Minister Oliver Dowden said it was right to remove the whip from Mr Andersen, but couldn't say whether it would be returned.
Going to be allowed back into the Conservative Party if he shows more contrition?
Well, that's a matter for the Chief Whip, but we set out the reasons why the whip was drawn was that failure to apologise. That's a matter for Lee Andersen.
You can't rule out him returning, having the whip returned. He may have the whip returned, will he, if he apologises?
No, I certainly wouldn't rule that out, but that's a matter for the Chief Whip.
Another debate on Gaza will be held in the Commons after the chaotic vote last Wednesday. The SNP says it will take up the Speaker, Sir Lindsay Hoyle's offer of a meaningful debate on a new ceasefire motion. There was uproar after he allowed MPs to vote on a Labour amendment, leading to calls for his resignation. SNP Westminster leader Stephen Flynn says his party will seek to move the debate forward that will push Parliament to support what he describes as concrete actions. The UK launched another round of airstrikes overnight against Houthi targets in Yemen. In a joint operation with the United States, 18 sites were hit across 8 locations. The Ministry of Defence says precision-guided bombs were used against drones and launchers. It follows a surge in attacks on commercial ships in the Red Sea. It's the 4th time the UK has been involved in strikes against the Iranian-backed group since mid-January. An action group has won its fight over plans to house asylum seekers in Cumbria. Despite a severe housing shortage in the Milham area, 8 properties were earmarked for 40 migrants. It sparked backlash in the community, with police forced to increase patrols after one house was vandalised. In a letter seen by GB News, the Home Office has now ruled that the site is not fit for asylum seekers. Dean Myers from Milham Communication Action Group told us it's a huge relief.
The community's just been totally confused. We didn't know who was actually coming into the HMOs. No one consulted us, and it just sparked a bit of anger, I think.
Donald Trump is another step closer to becoming the Republicans' presidential nominee. It's after he beat Nikki Haley in her home state of South Carolina, claiming 60% of the vote. It's his 4th straight primary win, despite being engulfed in legal problems.
An even bigger win than we anticipated, and I was just informed that we got double the number of votes that has ever been received in the great state of South Carolina. So That's pretty good. So it's a record ×2.
Junior doctors in England are on the picket lines for a second day. They're striking for 5 days in a dispute over pay, this being the 10th time they've walked out since March last year. The Health Secretary is calling for more talks with the union, saying the British Medical Association refused to put the government's latest offer to its members. The BMA is asking for a 35% pay restoration as a starting position, but says it's open to negotiations. For the latest stories, sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts. Now, it's back to Dawn.
Thank you very much, Pip. Now, loads of you have been getting in touch with your thoughts. Please do keep them coming. It's all about you. GB Views at GB News, right? Some great ones coming in here. Interesting. Lee Andersen, a lot of you getting very worked up about this. Steve, good afternoon, Steve. Lee Andersen is a role model for all the other cowardly Conservative MPs who are scared of the woke mob to speak up. Millions of Brits totally agree with Lee and would say exactly what he has been suspended for if they were in his shoes. Yes, millions of us. Very, very, very strong viewpoints there. Meanwhile, the Just Stop Oil protesters also getting you agitated. Simon, good afternoon, Simon. What is this country coming to? It's a joke. How can people be allowed to do this, but the police won't do anything? It's a joke about people's rights. If they break the law, arrest them. Very, very strong opinions. But as I said, please do keep them coming in because it's all about you and what you're thinking. Now, private security is being deployed to protect MPs amid warnings that the Israel-Hamas conflict is a generational radicalising moment. Some female MPs are also now using chauffeur-driven cars as part of the move to close the gap between protection given to the cabinet ministers as standard and measures for backbenchers, now also considered highly vulnerable. But I want to know how we ended up in this position where MPs need bodyguards. I mean, it's not just the high-profile cabinet ministers, we understand that, but backbench MPs that you probably don't even know their names of. Joining me now is political commentator Stephen Carlton-Woods. Stephen, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Afternoon. Now, Stephen, I find this utterly shocking that we are in a situation in the United Kingdom where our MPs feel so threatened that this has to happen. What do you make of this?
Well, unfortunately, it's a sign of the times, but it's nothing new within British politics. I mean, if we go back to 1979 with the death of Erin Eve, and the IRA were behind that blowing up in 1979, we've had a series of attacks and terrible outcomes with certain politicians, but mainly in from 79 till the early 20s, there was the early 2000s rather. It was really the IRA were the main bulk of attacks against politicians and some of the worst atrocities against the public. But we've seen that change since 2010, where we come to the term now of Islamic radicalists or Islamists, what Lee Andersen calls them. Now, if we just look at the language behind that, because it's very important when we talk about language. So Islamic radicalists or Islamists doesn't mean the religion Islam by definition. It points at the political ideology that exploits the religion Islam in itself. So people are all getting het up about this terminology and saying it's racist. It's not racist to point out there's a political ideology that's wrecking an organisation and a religion, and people tend to paint it with the same brush. So this is where the problem goes. But ever since 2010, we've seen a massive increase where the IRA have been replaced basically by these radicalists that have done all sorts of terrible things. And in the last two deaths we've had with our politicians, Joe Cox and Sir David Ames, and then we've seen this grow, but there's other groups that are coming onto that now. So out of all the ones we get today of the attacks on politicians, 74% of them are radicalists or Islamic radicalists, such as you've got the Manchester reunion bombing as well, and the stabbing of Lee Rigby and stuff like that. So these things, it's a bit of a snowball effect. But then you can break it down into different sections. You've got the far left with their attacks on people's houses. 11% environmentalists. Don't forget the attack to the Prime Minister's home in Richmond some time ago. And that's been in the news today about their plans of attacking MPs' houses. 8% of them are environmentalists. Far-right extremists, just 3%. And it's funny you hear the left wing blaming the right wing for all these atrocities, when in fact it's a very small number of far-right extremists. 3% are down to mental health, and then there's 1% others. I made an interesting note of all that this morning because I was trying to collate the actual identify who the deaths were and how far it is. So I think there is a time now where Parliament needs to factor in security for its MPs, because it's as though you're not allowed to have a view. You can't express yourself because it offends someone. And we've seen with the Conservative Party jolting to expel Lee Andersen, remove the whip, without looking at what the language actually is. And he believes he's a straight-talking guy, a down-to-earth guy, and he says it how he sees it. So are we going to bring everyone into rein everyone in that does that with not expressing themselves? If that's the way he expresses himself that way. And I don't believe that looking at the definition of what radicalism is, or Islamists, it's not looking at the religion itself, it's looking at the political ideology behind it. So why has he had the whip removed for that? And in the light of, we've seen the commotion that went on last week with the vote on the Gaza situation, it's beyond belief, really, the way we're all going, and we're so scared of upsetting the wrong people. So even Sir Lindsay Hoyle was scared and wanted to protect Labour MPs because of language and upsetting the wrong people. We've got to get a grip on this and go in the right direction. And enough's enough with language. Be clear about what you're saying and who you're directing it at. And we should be all right with that. But I would agree that MPs need extra protection.
Stephen, thank you very much. That's Stephen Carlton Woods, our political commentator, joining us on that one. We saw, frankly, chaotic is putting it politely this week, isn't it, Aaron, in the House, when we had the mob outside. We have From the River to the Sea beamed onto the Elizabeth Tower, Big Ben, etc. And we saw Lindsay Hoyle basically admitting that he was very worried about MPs' safety. So, I mean, maybe we shouldn't be surprised at this story this weekend that, female MPs in particular do need extra security.
There's a few things here. We need to take the safety of MPs very seriously.
Yes.
We've had 2 MPs killed in the last, 8 years. Yeah. Plus, of course, the Mike Freer incident. That's very important, and I'm glad more resources are going towards it. What I would say is, with regards to what happened last week, I don't believe Sir Lindsay. If you read a story from the Sunday Times this week, out today actually, saying that this was a political play by Keir Starmer and his chief whip to ensure that there was not a vote which would be politically divisive for him, I'm inclined to think that actually Sir Lindsay should resign. This is a man who's a former Labour MP. His father is a Labour peer. I think he did a favour to Keir Starmer so that he could... You
don't actually think what Sir Lindsay Hoyle did has anything to do with...
Well, I don't know. I can't read his mind. But if you read the Sunday Times piece, they talk about Keir Starmer going in, coming out, all smiles, his own staff saying they did a number on Lindsay Hoyle, Labour sources telling Nick Watt at the BBC on the night we did this so that we wouldn't have a vote. This is a brilliant day for us. So you put all of that together. Sir Lindsay Hoyle defied parliamentary convention in a John Bercow-esque way, and I think he did so without any legitimacy whatsoever. In spite of that, I think at the same time, so it's 2 things are true, right? I think he should probably resign. At the same time, there is clearly threats to MPs and they need to be looked after. And I think it's also important to say, historically, we've looked after senior members of the Cabinet the Leader of the Opposition. Yeah. That probably now needs to apply to backbenchers too.
Which is sad.
It's very... I'll finish with this, sorry, because I spoke a lot, but I'll say this. You don't want your political class to be inoculated from the rest of society. You want to be able to do your shopping on a weekend and see your Member of Parliament. We can't complain about an out-of-touch political elite, which I do, 365 days a year.
Regularly, yes.
But then behaviour like this means that they can't be in touch with their community.
And obviously, Sir Lindsay Hoyle is not here to defend himself. I mean, either reason he did what he did the other day isn't great, is it? Whether it's protecting the Labour Party or genuinely worried about the fears. And he has apologised, but What do you make of this story?
There's two things in relation to what happened on that Gaza debate. Number one, did or did not Sir Keir Starmer apply inappropriate pressure to the Speaker to make a decision that led to the chaotic results that we saw in the House? If the answer is yes, and I don't care why, he needs to go, Sir Keir Starmer. Nonetheless, Sir Lindsay Hoyle made the decision he did to go against convention. He has said, as you mentioned earlier, that that's because he was concerned about security of members of the House. Well, if that's not the case, if he simply submitted to the pressure that Sir Keir Starmer applied, then he should go. If indeed, and it's when you look at the disruption in the last couple of days even, Conservative Party and Labour Party fundraising events have been interrupted, invaded by crowds of people. They're Muslims and they're associated with the Gaza debate itself. And one can't help but put everything we know together and say our members of Parliament are being coerced because of threats or intimidation, implied threat, and that we were talking about harassment earlier. That can make people very nervous as well. Are our politicians being influenced by threats and coercion? Because if they are, this nation has an existential threat to its parliamentary democracy, and it is not right. It is, in fact, it is entirely wrong and cowardly for the Prime Minister, for Sir Keir Starmer or anybody else sitting in the House of Commons, any other political leader, to not call it what it is, if it's there. And you know, it's difficult to say. Thankfully, we haven't seen physical attacks recently on politicians. But if they are being influenced by the threat or the concern about that, then we have a serious problem.
And we don't want to see any more. But what do we do about this, Aaron? We are where we are now. We have seen... And frankly, as a female MP, I mean, I would be worried walking through the crowd that are outside. Yeah. Look, no one's saying you shouldn't demonstrate outside Parliament. That's the place to demonstrate. But it was fairly aggressive.
Well, I would be less... I'm not concerned about protests outside Parliament, because you've got big concentration...
No, I'm not saying that's the place to protest.
I'm just going to delimit something, so people might find disagreeable statements or whatever. What's more worrying for me is seeing, like you say, a lone MP walking away from a fundraiser being shouted at. I think that's quite concerning, because ultimately, at the House of Commons, you have the police, people have a right to protest. There's a broad agreed understanding of somebody might do something and you can respond appropriately. Going about your everyday business and just being blindsided by something is a bit different, I think. What I would say is, and this is going to sound a bit strange, I think all of this is an argument for proportional representation. Because we have a problem, which is millions of people, rightly, feel locked out from politics. They don't feel represented by politicians. That's true. That's absolutely true. And so increasingly, people resort to things like direct action, to protest. In a similar way with Brexit, the referendum was a pressure valve for that. I think in the long term, this broken two-party duopoly we have means you'll only see more of this. And it won't just come from the left, by the way. So I think we have a political class incapable of solving problems, doing things, constructing a positive vision for the future. You will see a lot more of this. And that's not to let people off the hook if they do something bad, but I think it also points to the fact we have a failed political system in this country.
I think you're right. And in fact, what we're talking about with the security is distancing those politicians even further. But how many politicians do you see going drinking in their local pub properly, rather than a political visit? One thing, just very briefly, not so very long ago, Prime Ministers and Cabinet Ministers could walk from their offices to the Palace of Westminster for their debates. Can you imagine that happening now? And in those days, there were some very passionate feelings against the decisions that some of the government was making. But still, the British people did not feel that it was appropriate, proper, or the right way to exercise their opinion by harassing them.
So have we lost respect for our politicians? Are we losing respect for one another? GB Views at GB News. Let us know what you think. Very important. Now, for all the best analysis and opinion, even better than these two, on that story and so much much more, please go to our website, gbnews.com. You're watching and listening, if you're listening on the radio, hello, to GB News Sunday with me, Dawn Neeson. Lots more coming up on today's show. We've just been talking about this, haven't we? The SNP says it will push for another Commons debate on Gaza following the chaotic vote on the conflict earlier this week. There was uproar in the Commons when Speaker Sir Lindsay Hoyle allowed MPs to vote on a Labour amendment to the SNP ceasefire motion. But is this just gesture politics and a huge waste of time? All of that and much more to come. You're watching and listening to GB News, Britain's news channel. Don't go too far.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Patrick Christie's Tonight. Weekdays from 9 p.m.
Former First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has made her much-anticipated appearance before the Scottish COVID inquiry today. It comes after allegations emerged that she deleted key pandemic WhatsApp messages, used the pandemic to push her own political agenda. But let's just cast our mind back, shall we, to August 2021, when Sturgeon was asked if she'd hand over all her WhatsApps to the inquiry. Here we go.
I think if you understand statutory public inquiries, you would know that even if I wasn't prepared to give that assurance, which for the avoidance of doubt I am, then I wouldn't have the ability. This will be a judge-led statutory public inquiry.
Which, for the avoidance of doubt, I am. OK. Well, you weren't, were you? But fast forward to today, and she was much less forthcoming.
WhatsApp messages between yourself and Mr Yusuf and Ms Lloyd were produced by you. Where did you get them?
They were provided to me through the Scottish Government.
But did you delete them?
Yes.
Did you consider yourself, against that background and your considerable ministerial experience, to be precisely the right First Minister for the job?
No, that's not how I would have thought of it at all. There's a large part of me wishes that I hadn't been.
All right, then. I'm joined now by Tory MP Lee Andersen. Lee, are those just crocodile tears?
Well, it looks like crocodile tears to me, Patrick. I mean, first we had the missing camper van. Nobody knows where that is. Now we've got this nonsense. We've got these burner phones, dodgy £5 phones from wherever they bought them from, WhatsApp messages going missing. It all looks a little bit dodgy to me. I mean, she's bleating on there, she's crying on screen. This is not cutting no ice. You know, it's crocodile tears. It makes you wonder what the SNPs are all about, Patrick. It looks... I mean, the people that have burner phones, let's be clear, people that have these dodgy phones where you can't trace them and disappearing WhatsApp messages, these are normally criminals, these are drug dealers. And you know what? These SNPs are no better than criminals.
Join us every night on GB News at 11 p.m. for Headliners, which is 3 top comedians going through the next day's news stories, which is exactly what you need, because when the establishment has gone crazy, you need some craziness to make sense of it.
Headliners. You don't have to bother reading the newspaper. We've got it covered for you. Every night at 11 p.m. and repeated every morning at 5 a.m. We won't send you to sleep like some of the other paper review shows out there.
So join us 11 p.m. every night on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall? Let's find out together.
For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Welcome back to GB News Sunday with me, Dawn Neeson, on your TV, online and on digital radio. Now, loads of you have been getting in touch with your thoughts, and please keep them coming in. They're on your screen, GB Views at GB News. Really, really simple. So lots of people getting really upset that Just Stop Oil have been saying they are willing to target, not attack, target MPs at their homes. Nathan says, oh, not sitting on the fence here, are you, Nathan? I just hate Just Stop Oil when they're stopping ordinary people going to work, but MPs, as long as it's peaceful, is fine by me. But you wouldn't want them in your living room, would you, Nathan? That's the point. Meanwhile, Kenneth on Just Stop Oil says, when they lay in the way of ambulances, people trying to get to work, buses, pedestrians, that's OK. I don't think so. And the way they referred to... I thought this was an interesting point. It was a bit sneery, wasn't it? Referring to Sunak's houses is rude and unnecessary. I suspect some of the protesters have second homes, don't they? And they're probably not even insulated, are they? Because they go on about that as well. In any case, we move on. Because we've got the SNP to talk about. Woo, lucky us. The SNP says it will push for another Commons debate on Gaza following the chaotic vote on the conflict on Wednesday. There was uproar. How can we forget? There was uproar in the Commons when Speaker Sir Lindsay Hoyle allowed MPs to vote on a Labour amendment to the SNP's ceasefire motion. It meant the SNP motion was not voted on, prompting the party to say that Sir Lindsay should quit as Speaker. But I'm sorry, this is just a massive waste of time. I'm going to come to you on this one, Henry. OK. Like anyone in Gaza and Israel is going to take the blindest bit of notice of not just what the Conservatives or the Tory or the Labour Party say, but what the SNP say about this. We're getting a bit above ourselves here, aren't we?
We are a little bit, aren't we? First of all, get this out of the way. I think it was chaotic the other day. The debate fell apart, effectively. And so I think having made the decision to have a debate, then they probably need to rerun it. But you're absolutely right, Dawn. I think nobody's going to pay the blindest bit of attention in the Middle East as to what the SNP say. Now, of course, this will be a vote in Parliament, so it's the British Parliament. But again, look, there is pressure being put on Hamas by the Iranian regime, and by their own ideology. There is pressure, massive pressure being put on Prime Minister Netanyahu to rein back in some of what he's doing. He's not listening to any of it. No, so you're right. This is posturing. And, Hamza Yousaf, the SNP leader, has been very outspoken about his thoughts about the Israelis and about the Gaza situation. That's what's driving this. It's rather like we were saying just now. This is politicians effectively kowtowing to their own constituency, which is legitimate. But in this case, it's a constituency that is driving an agenda relating to a foreign conflict. We have imported, effectively, into our politics a foreign conflict. It's playing out in British politics.
It's not like we haven't got enough to worry about in this country, is it? And what no one actually mentioned on that, I think chaos is putting it politely, on that evening, is that over in Jerusalem, the Israeli government were quietly announcing that it would never recognise a Palestinian state, that the two-state solution, as far as they're concerned, is finished. So, all our whatever side they're on, debating this again when we've got a cost of living crisis, the NHS, the small boat situation. Why are we talking about something that we can't do anything about?
Well, it's important to say there are many other stories. I agree entirely with that. But I'm surprised that Henry would do Britain down. We've got we're a permanent... We're a permanent member of the UN Security Council. We've got nuclear weapons. We sell one of the biggest arms companies in the world, BAE Systems. The idea that Britain doesn't matter with regards to influencing countries like Israel is, I think, not correct. Britain's not America, it's not China, but it certainly has some heft. Israel has seen, I think, its GDP decline by around 20%. Sovereign wealth funds like in Norway are dumping Israeli bonds. It is beginning to bear the brunt of what any country would, of course. Any country's economy is hit by war. So I think it would be a small variable. I don't think it's a game changer if Britain demands a ceasefire, but I think it's a small variable, and I think it sends something of a signal. Australia, New Zealand, Canada are calling for a ceasefire. Now, historically, the Five Eyes, those three countries plus us and the US, act together. And I think if the UK went with those guys and away from the US, I think that would be a big deal. It's not the Britain of 1924, but the Britain of 2024 is still quite an influential power.
I know, but this is driven by the SNP, remember. The Israelis will watch it, the Israelis will say, yes, this is driven by the SNP, and everybody's kind of going along with it, and they won't pay any attention to it. But you're right, it does have a little bit of influence. But what has a great deal more influence is what's going on in the background. And, in the communication between ministers and the Israeli authorities and so on. It's those quiet conversations that we don't see and hear that will, be the influential ones, if there are any influential ones. I think the other thing, though, is that, and I'd like to put this on record now, I'm very uncomfortable, not so much now, but when the Israelis were pumping massive amounts of munitions into Gaza, dropping, it was. I've done military targeting, and to be able to do specific targeting, intelligence-led targeting on that many targets in that briefer period of time, and utilising all of those different assets and different weapon systems. I do not believe that the Israelis were doing precision targeting with all of the munitions they were throwing at Gaza. And I had concerns about that. I still have concerns about that. But I think ultimately the problem with this debate has been that it is one-sided. It's basically basically, we all know it, whatever's said, it's calling on the State of Israel to implement a ceasefire. It's not condemning Hamas. It should be.
Who have, and Israel have stated, and Hamas have stated that they're going to carry on until they've destroyed. That's basically the mission statements, isn't it? Right, OK, again, we're running out of time, blimey. You're watching GB News Sunday with me, Dawn Neeson, or possibly listening on the radio, or possibly both if you're multitasking. There's lots more to come on today's show, but here's the news headlines with Pip Thompson.
It's 2:30. Good afternoon. I'm Pip Thompson in the GB newsroom. Labour is demanding assurances that suspended MP Lee Andersen won't have the whip returned. Today, the former deputy chair still refused to apologise for saying that the London mayor was controlled by Islamists. Shadow Cabinet Office Minister Jonathan Ashworth has written to the Prime Minister to confirm that he won't be allowed back into the party. Deputy Prime Minister Oliver Dowden says he does not believe Mr Andersen is Islamophobic and told Camilla Tominey that while it was right to remove the whip, he couldn't say whether it would be returned.
To be allowed back into the Conservative Party if he shows more contrition?
Well, that's a matter for the chief whip, but we set out the reasons why the whip was drawn was that failure to apologise. That's a matter for Lee Andersen.
You can't rule out him having the whip returned. He may have the whip returned, will he, if he apologises?
No, I certainly wouldn't rule that out, but that's a matter for the chief whip.
The SNP says it will take up the Speaker Sir Lindsay Hoyle's offer of a meaningful debate on a new Gaza ceasefire motion. There was uproar after he allowed MPs to vote on a Labour amendment last Wednesday, leading to calls for his resignation. SNP Westminster leader Stephen Flynn says his party will now push Parliament to support what he describes as concrete actions. Migrants have been intercepted trying to cross the Channel for the first time in a week. More than 230 people were found on 5 small boats today and were taken to the Border Force Processing Centre in Dover. For the latest stories, you can sign up to GB News Alerts by scanning the QR code on your screen or go to gbnews.com/alerts.
Thank you very much, Pip. Remember, you can get in touch about all of the stories we're discussing today by emailing me on gbviews@gbnews.com or messaging on our socials @gbnews. There's loads more coming up on today's show. Now, Islamophobia and anti-Semitic hate cases have more than tripled in the UK since Hamas carried out their 7th of October attacks on Israel, with a 589% increase in the number of incidents of anti-Semitism. Sobering stuff. All of that and much more to come. I'm Dawn Neeson and you're watching and listening to GB News, Britain's news channel.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall? Let's find out together. For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
Martin Daubney, weekdays from 3 p.m.
Welcome to the show. Superb stuff, great footage. So you're right in the thick of it there. What's the mood on the ground?
Well, I've left there now. I've actually now come to that EU Council summit that I was talking about. It's still pretty chaotic. The entire city of Brussels has been completely clogged with these tractors, sort of 3 abreast in most of the roads across the city. The people of Brussels aren't particularly happy. I mean, this is sort of reminiscent for some people of the Just Stop Oil protests, you know, people gluing themselves. People are unable to get to hospital appointments, and there's a lot of upset about the destruction that's happening on the streets of Brussels today. But on the other side, there's also the protests, which the farmers are saying that EU green laws simply are not able to fit with what they need to do to keep their businesses going. And just before the protests happened, we saw the European Commission actually make some concessions to the farmers' protests. And this is on the demands that were put on them to set aside somewhere in the region of 5% of their land for regrowing for biodiversity. A lot of the farmers have said that's not possible, and the European Commission has said that they can delay that coming in. So they have won a small concession with these protests.
And Jack, there's a feeling as well, a huge dissatisfaction that the European Union has managed to find 50 billion euros in aid to send to Ukraine, and yet farmers in particular are on the receiving end of net zero targets, taxation on diesel and endless red tape. So many farmers, Jack, saying they're measuring ditches to see if they have to drain them or not. There are minimum requirements on the width of battery hen enclosures, endless red tape. As Jeremy Clarkson pointed out in Clarkson's farm in Britain, they've simply had enough, and they're shouting, Ursula von der Leyen, we are here.
I think the most exciting bit for me is talking to people.
People who I think are ignored often by the major news channels. We're going to give news they want to hear. There's a voice there that needs to be heard. I think there's a chance here for a diversity of opinion to be expressed, which you don't find elsewhere. It's really exciting.
We don't hold back. We're free to say how decisions that are taken here
affect us all around the country. Only on GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Welcome back to GB News Sunday with me, Dawn Neeson, on your TV, online and on digital radio. Now, Islamophobia and anti-Semitic hate crimes have more than tripled in the UK since Hamas carried out their horrific attacks on the 7th of October. Charity Tell Mama, who monitor hate crime, say most Islamophobic cases are happening on social media, but they have recorded a rise in physical assaults, abusive behaviour, threats and acts of vandalism. There has also been a 589% increase in the number of incidents of anti-Semitism since those Hamas attacks. Joining me now, I'm pleased to say, is social policy analyst Dr. Rakib Ehsan and Jewish freelance journalist Nicole Lampert. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. Really appreciate your time on this Sunday afternoon. I wanted to speak to both of you because you're both very eloquent in the subject, and I just want to... We can pontificate on the panel what we like, but you two are living this. Nicole, I'm going to come to you first. What's it actually like being Jewish in London at the moment?
Thank you, Dawn. Thank you for inviting me on. What's it like? It feels at times like there are walls that are closing in on you. And sometimes when I speak to, just like as I did just earlier, someone who's had anti-Semitism within their own family, her daughter's at university, was at a dinner for her college, and someone just decided to stand up in the middle of the dinner and said, how can we sit here when there are Zionists in the room? And I've talked to parents of 8-year-olds who were being told Hitler was right. It's affecting every Jew, not only because we're hearing these stories, but because we are afraid to go into the West End on a Saturday. We are trying to still deal with the loss of what happened on October 7th. None of us are happy about what we're seeing in Gaza, and we feel that weighs upon us too. And there's a real feeling of it's really bad. No one seems to be stopping it, and it's just getting worse. And this is happening not just in London; it's happening across the country, but across the world too. We see that people are talking about the same thing in America. The university campuses are horrendous. That it's happening in Australia, where people are singing. No one knows whether they're singing "gas the Jews" or "kill the Jews" or "get the Jews," but whatever it was anti-Semitic. So this is going on everywhere, and so it's frightening because there's something that we say at Passover, which is in every generation they will rise against us. And we somehow thought that we were immune to that, to the latest genocidal group trying to kill us. And then once again, we see anti-Semitism raising its head and no one apparently able to do anything.
Rakib, let's come to you. On the opposite side, I mean, Islamophobia has also risen horrifically. And I think it's shocking in 2024 that we are seeing these kind of incidents in not just London, but in all our cities across the country. What has it meant to you personally?
Well, I don't really like talking much about myself, Dawn, to be fair. And I think that ultimately I've come here not as some kind of community spokesperson, but ultimately as a social cohesion expert. But one thing I'll say is that I've observed an explosion in both anti-Jewish and anti-Muslim hatred since October the 7th. And I think it's placing fundamental strain on our multi-faith democracy, a democracy that usually I'm very proud of. And I think it's a democracy to be treasured and protected. And I think what we need to talk about here, if I'm just looking from a broader British Muslim perspective, we need to have very serious conversations, not just conversations, we need to take action again when it comes to anti-Semitism within British Muslim communities. Now, there's a range of perfectly legitimate criticisms to make of the current Israeli government. In my view, there's far-right members of that government, such as Bezalel Smotrich, Itamar Ben-Gvir. I think that Benjamin Netanyahu, to be quite honest, is not remotely interested in any kind of peace settlement under any circumstance. You can make those criticisms without indulging in anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, the vilification of British Jews. British Jews should not be treated as agents of the current Israeli government, and Mossad, which is the national intelligence agency in Israel. Equally, British Muslims are perfectly entitled to legitimately protest in favour of the cause of Palestinian statehood, and those British Muslims who protest peacefully should not be treated as agents of Hamas, which is a proscribed terrorist organisation. But one thing I'll say about the demonstrations that Nicole refers to in London, there's been very clear cases of anti-Semitic chanting, displaying of pro-terror paraphernalia, and direct incitements to violence against Jewish people. And I've been very concerned by the lack of law and order robustness when it comes to those kind of actions and behaviours taking place at demonstrations.
Nicole, coming back to you, I mean, what did you make of the fact that from the river to the sea was beamed onto, I'm calling it Big Ben shorthand, but onto Big Ben this week, and the chaos, and that's putting it politely, that we witnessed in our democratically elected House this week?
Well, I think that's the point, isn't it? That they call anti-Semitism the canary in the coal mine, which is when it rears its head, then it's a sign of a sickness in a society. And we are definitely seeing that with our democracy, that it's not just Jews that are scared. It's many, many people, including politicians. And I know there's been some debate about it, but I spoke to a Labour MP on about Tuesday, and she was telling me how frightened she was to not be voting for a ceasefire because she was afraid of threat to her life, and she's been in touch with the police, and I know she's not the only one. So it's a massive issue, and the fact that this sign was put up on Big Ben, which is kind of the symbol of our nation and certainly the symbol of our democracy, shows you everything about the danger that not just Jews are in, but our entire democracy is in.
Rakib, just finally, quickly, because we're running out of time, just finally, what did you make of the events in Parliament this week?
I thought it was embarrassing. If truth be told, Dawn, I think to twist conventional parliamentary procedure in such a way, I think Sir Lindsay Hoyle should no longer be in the position that he's in. I think that I've talked about this Islamist-inspired erosion of parliamentary democracy for some time. And many of the responses to what's taking place in Parliament, people talking about how elected MPs, they need to have their security details beefed up. But I think the main issue for me is the British political establishment for too long has not prioritised national security and public safety the way it should have. And this is why we have got to this very worrying point.
Thank you so much, both of you. That's Nicole Lampert and Rakib Ehsan. Thank you so much for joining me this afternoon. Really appreciate your time. Sobering words there. It's not a good time, is it? But there's lots more coming up on today's show. Now, the youngsters have it all too easy. A mind-blowing 93% of 18 to 24-year-olds can't even be bothered to go to an in-person job interview. I want to know, are Generation Lazy actually just taking the mick? All of that and much more to come. I'm Dawn Neeson. You're watching GB News, Britain's news channel. Don't go too far.
Tired of the usual focus-tested, pre-prepared Westminster runaround? Well, so am I. So you want higher taxes? Is your department to blame for this? Are you rethinking this policy? Every Sunday at 9:30, I'll be sitting down with those in power to get the truth about the issues affecting you. Let's be honest, we've known about the cost pressures of this project for years, not months. That's the Camilla Tominey Show, a politics show with personality. On GB News, the People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Britain's newsroom, weekday mornings from 9:30.
The EU rules are trying to choke even that.
Yeah, yeah.
And I just think, you know, I would join this protest in a heartbeat. And you are right to point out this stuff about them being right-wing. How dare they slate them as right-wing when these are real people whose livelihoods
And
are
remember,
being
a lot of
trashed.
people who work in the farm industry, Malone, get paid very little money.
They get paid.
Agricultural workers are very badly paid.
They get paid nothing, Pierce. And, you know, the profits... I think on Clarkson's Farm I read somewhere that I saw that when you sell it like a sheep's skin, it's 30 pence or something.
Right.
And you say, what?
Yeah.
And so you wonder how they can manage that. And I think after a year, Clarkson made a handful of pounds.
He made like 90 quid profit or something.
In a whole year working.
But Carol makes a really good point, though, doesn't she, Nikki, about this idea that we go to the supermarkets, we shop there, we eat our food, we don't often give it a thing. And the farmers have become so frustrated by this idea that they are not respected.
Absolutely. I mean, they're running what are effectively small businesses, often family businesses that have been passed down through generations. They also tend to know the land and the animals better than anyone else in those areas. You know, I am all for green protests, you know, I'm all for climate change activism, but actually... the only way you can do that is gradually. It's exactly what we've seen with Port Talbot. You know, you can't just go in and say you're not going to do it anymore this way. You've got to do it this way instead.
The Tata Steel thing.
Yes, exactly. You've got to do it this way instead. You know, lots of farmers are on board with protecting the planet, but they can't do it overnight. You've got to give them time. So they're protesting. You know, they're saying no farmers, no food.
When
well,
you
it
say
can't
you
get any more
support
obvious.
some of these environmental protests, you're not one of these closet supporters of Just Stop Oil, are you?
I'm not a closet supporter. I think I've been quite open about Just Stop Oil.
No.
I don't like all their methods, but I do like the
any of
message.
them.
But I do appreciate the message. But sometimes you've got to do difficult things.
What they're asking for now, those protesters, are unrealistic. What these protesters are asking for is not unrealistic.
No.
2024, a battleground year.
The year the nation decides.
As the parties gear up their campaigns for the next general election.
Who will be left standing when the British people make one of the biggest decisions of their lives?
Who will rise?
And who will fall? Let's find out together. For every moment, the highs, the lows, the twists and turns.
We'll be with you for every step of this journey.
In 2024, GB News is Britain's election channel.
That was a joke. Welcome back to GB News Sunday with me, Dawn Neeson, on your TV, online and on digital radio. Now, would you ever not turn up to a job interview? Well, Generation Lazy is driving employers mad, as more than 90% of 18 to 24-year-olds say they have not turned up to an interview because they can't be bothered. So I'm asking, do they have it too easy? Now, we've discovered some really heavy stuff today, so I'm actually going to try and have some fun with this one as well, but we're not going to be too hard on young people, Henry. Right, so actually we're going to come to you first as the more senior member of the panel. I mean it in the kindest possible way. Henry, back in the day, right, a job interview, I would get so nervous. I would be there hours beforehand, making sure everything was rehearsed. I do notes, as you've seen. And I might find this astonishing. They just can't even bother to turn up. They don't phone up and say, I'm sorry, I can't come to the interview. They just don't go.
I think it's bizarre. I've not heard this, but if that's the case, then if I hadn't got up in the morning, then my father would have thrown a bucket of water over me. And I suppose now you've got a whole...
Dad, by the way. I think mine was the same.
But I suppose now you've got a situation where actually children have got... And they won't recognise what I'm going to say now. Of course they won't. But have a far less discipline at home or at school. Less self-discipline. They you know, if they've got a school uniform, they rebel against it. They either the tie is round their belly button or it's so short that it's absolutely ridiculous. Their shirts are hanging out, and their trousers are too short, and they've got no self-respect, no self-discipline, and they reject discipline from anybody else. So how's this come about? I really don't know, but I see it daily. I live near a school, and it's just. It hurts me. And I wonder whether this actually... I know we've talked about serious things earlier. Whether this is feeding into those serious topics and why the country's got a problem.
A lack of respect for MPs, a lack of respect
and actually for other people.
Yeah, for people in general.
Because somebody's been good enough to give this person an interview, and they're not being good enough to respect that fact and just say, even make a phone call and say, look, I'm sorry, I can't make it.
This is incredible. I mean, there's one comment in here that's from Gen Z, by the way, which is 18 to 24, and millennials are as bad, by the way, and they are 25 to 39. There was a comment in this piece, and it's a survey, by the way, saying, by not going to an interview, I feel empowered over that company. Huh? Aaron, what do you make of this? Stop sniggering at the back there, young man.
I presume you feel empowered as well when you can't afford to pay your phone bills and the water's cut off.
Exactly.
And, very empowering.
Bank and mum and dad.
Well, so there's two things here. Firstly, I don't think young people have it easy. I think young people actually, on housing, on the deal they're going to get with regards to pensions, they'll probably never retire. NHS, lots of things aren't going in their favour. And I'd agree with what Henry's saying. I'd actually capsize it a bit. I'd say they're also being let down with stuff like this. So, for instance, in the last 20 years, I am so grateful, by the way, I went to school before mobile phones and social media.
Yeah, oh, God, yeah, hallelujah.
It's incredible that we let kids have mobile phones in schools. And it's not me being harsh or authoritarian. That's not good for them in terms of cyberbullying, in terms of concentration, academic performance, in terms of anxiety disorders. We know all of this. And again, we talked earlier on about, actually, probably most people think there should be a big test for British Transport Police. I would imagine most people think that kids shouldn't have phones in schools. So I think this lack of rules is letting kids down. And what I'd say is, quickly, we over-police young people with regards to offline behaviour. Don't play on the street. Every stranger's dangerous. But then when it comes to online stuff, it's the Wild West. Knock yourself out. And so I think we are letting them down in a bunch of ways. And I don't think it's the kids' fault, actually. I think it's on the rest of us as adults to offer leadership.
Aaron, I don't know whether you know, but most schools now, secondary schools, they almost require the children to have mobile phones, because then they can have an app, they can see whether there's a change in their lessons or anything else. It's all online, which, you know, the government's driving this. The government is, there's no question, they've been driving the rollout of IT. Maybe we've gone too far. You know, children aren't talking to each other in the playground, they're texting each other, even if there's a child next to them. You know, they want to text rather than speak. There's a whole range of social problems that are coming from this. And I don't know whether that's the problem, but, you know, it's got to be part of it. And how can we have this discussion? Instead of the SNP debating Gaza, they should be debating this.
Well, exactly. Yeah. They can do something about this, probably.
Yeah,
I think it's probably our fault. That's our generation's fault, Henry. I'm sorry, I'm blaming us.
No, I'm not blaming myself. I'm blaming the rest of them out there. It's all their mothers.
Can I quickly say, I do think phones are a huge part, because we have put less and less emphasis on human relations.
Yeah.
So if you're letting somebody else down, no big deal.
Yeah. I've got to have human relations with Nana now. Because...
Go on.
That's it. I've run out of time. You two are just so brilliant. But stay tuned, because Nana is up next with a cracking show. Nana, what are you doing?
With the shenanigans that happened with the Conservative Party, would you advise Lee Andersen to join Reform? We'll be asking that, as Nigel Farage has given him the invite, so it'd be interesting if he takes it up. Then is there any place for diversity and inclusion in the army, as they put forward a proposal to get more women on there, and then only 10 of them show up? Plus, I've got an amazing exclusive with Vitaly Klitschko, because yesterday it was 2 years since Ukraine. We would have put that out yesterday, but of course, all the things that went on. So loads to get through for the show, but hopefully you'll stay with me for that.
Definitely stay with Nana for that. It sounds like a brilliant show coming up. Right, OK, well, we've run out of time on our show. Thank you so much for watching, and thank you so much for all your messages on that. It's been a wonderful Sunday afternoon with these two, so thank you to Aaron Bassani and Henry Bolton for joining us. I hope you agree they are very, very good debaters, and I mean that in the nicest possible way. But as I said, don't go anywhere. Nana is up next, and thank you very much for watching and listening if you're on the radio. Have a wonderful rest of your weekend. Before we go to Nana, should we have a look at what the weather's doing out there for you?
Looks like things are heating up. Boxed boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
Hello there, I'm Jonathan Vautry here with your GB News weather forecast provided by the Met Office. Southern districts are bearing the brunt of the rainfall today. We've seen it sweeping its way in, some heavy pauses at times, and it will stay very persistent, particularly in the southeast right throughout tonight. With this additional rainfall adding on top of what we've already had this winter, we could see some disruption in places. Elsewhere, some clearer spells for the night, some showers pushing in across Scotland, falling as snow over the higher ground areas might bring some icy stretches, as well as temperatures begin to tumble off patchy frost across areas of Scotland and the far north of England as well. Temperatures just holding up a touch more underneath the cloud in the southeast, but it is going to be a very dreary, wet start here, and it will take some time for that rain to eventually clear its way off. Quite a brisk northeasterly wind pushing its way in will make it feel quite cold. That wind will also bring in some showers for northeast England and northeast Scotland, but there will be some sunny spells in between all of that, and into the afternoon many of us will have a fairly fine end to the day. Temperatures around where we'd expect them to be for the time of year. These fine conditions are being brought by a ridge of high pressure that is extending itself across the UK, but into Tuesday that is slowly going to sink its way southwards and allow this cold front to start moving its way in from the northwest. So starting to see wetter, windier conditions for Northern Ireland and Scotland that will eventually spread its way into England and Wales later on in the day. But for much of central, southeastern areas of England, it will be a fine, dry start to the morning with some sunshine in there. But it remains fairly unsettled and changeable right throughout the rest of this week. Enjoy the rest of your day. Bye-bye.
That warm feeling inside from Boxed Boilers, sponsors of weather on GB News.
I'm Michelle Dewberry, and I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'd much rather hear what you have to say. So send in your opinions to gbviews@gbnews.com. Keep them clean, and you never know, I might read them out.